Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Ariel Feldman, and I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program at Brite Divinity School and Texas Christian University. I'm very pleased to welcome you today to yet another lecture supported by the Lewis and Frieda Cristol Endowment for Academic Programming in Jewish Studies. Our guest speaker today is Professor Chris Seeman. Professor Seeman holds a PhD in Near Eastern religions from the University of California at Berkeley, and he serves as a professor of theology at Walsh University in North Canton, Ohio. Those of us who are interested in Second Temple Judaism in its Roman context will be familiar with Dr. Seeman's book on Rome and Judea in Transition, as well as his ongoing work, a very important one, on the new edition of the writings of the famous Josephus Flavius. Dr. Seeman also chairs the Catholic Biblical Association's task force on addressing representations of Jews and Judaism in Catholic exegesis and homiletics. And it is this important work of this task force that his presentation is focusing on today. So his talk is entitled Correcting Misrepresentations of Jews and Judaism in the Classroom, the Pulpit, and the Public Sphere. As you listen to Dr. Seeman presentation, please consider posting a question using the Q&A or chat option on the webinar website. I will monitor both, and at the end of his presentation, I'll try to present at least some of your questions to the speaker to respond. And those which we will not be able to present to him, we will probably try to send him over via email. So without much further ado, let's welcome Professor Seeman. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Feldman, and thank you all for having me. It's great to be here. I'll give you a little more background on myself about what draws me to this issue. So I was not trained in the study of misrepresentations of Jews and Judaism. That's not my area of specialty, although, as Dr. Feldman noted, I study Second Temple Judaism, I study New Testament, and I teach Bible, all of it. And so as a teacher, often we get a lot of assumptions about what is being said in these texts. And a lot of these assumptions come from the culture around us. And beyond that, there is also as we said, in the pulpit too, where do a lot of these misconceptions about Jews and Judaism come from? They come from what is preached and how things are preached, and also how people are taught, right, in parishes, in faith communities. And for myself, one of the things that gave me a greater understanding of the urgency for addressing this question was actually in my first job as a teacher. This was in Iowa about 10 years ago, in which there was a conference that my institution was sponsoring about, of all things, Israel-Palestine. And as such things can do, they often get into mutual recriminations and angry speech, as they are today. And what was very disturbing about this particular conference is that the organizers of it and the anti-Semitic, or at least anti-Jewish speech that was used there was not condemned at all. And they came to our institution. They made a lot of these statements, and then they left, leaving the community in shambles. And so at this point, I realized that no one else was going to take responsibility for this. And so I had to reach out to the local rabbi and the local imam, and I said, we need to find ways to educate the public about this so that these sorts of things don't happen, but also so that we can not just tell people what not to say, but how to approach a lot of the difficulties within the sacred texts that Jews and Christians hold in common, as well as on the Christian side, the challenging language that one finds in the New Testament, for example. And so it was really, as a teacher and someone aware of the impact that this language and these misconceptions can have on the public, both in and outside the classroom, that drew me to want to find ways to communicate about it. Then much more recently, this was in about 2016, I believe, Amy Jo Levine, who of course is a Jewish New Testament scholar, now retired from Vanderbilt, but who's written extensively on this issue, she gave an address to the Catholic Biblical Association in 2016 and charged us to do something about this as a group, as an organization. And so this was the birth of our task force, which was to see what was being said in the public, not just in the classroom, not just by teachers, but what was being preached, what do we find on the internet, and how can we counter that? Again, not just by telling people what not to say, but what is a positive alternative, which is historically more accurate and theologically more sound and ultimately productive of dialogue and understanding. And so that was the beginning of this task, was to figure out how to do that and where to intervene first. Because there are many points at which people receive these images and receive these understandings of things. And you can't do everything at once. And so we decided that we were going to focus on homiletics, how people preach, how Christians preach about certain texts, mainly from the New Testament, but also from the Hebrew Bible. And we began by trying to produce videos, which we would then put up on the website of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. We're still waiting to get them up there because it's a very long process of evaluation, whether they want to get them there. So in the meantime, since nothing was happening on that front, we decided to create what we call fact sheets. In other words, information that can be provided to anyone about here are the misconceptions and here are how they can be corrected. I'm going to share a screen with you to show you one that I did for this group, which can be accessed on our task force website, and maybe Ariel can find the link to that at some point. But we tried to find what were the big issues in the way the New Testament is read. And one of these is the representation of the Pharisees, which of course they're the whipping boys of most of the New Testament. And because so many things are foisted upon them by these texts, Christians who may be quite ignorant of Judaism, either in the time of Jesus or the present, will assume that Pharisees and the criticisms made of them are accurate about all Jews and all Judaism in all time. And so we tried to actually do research mainly on the internet, but also in some text publications of what were some of the things that were said about Pharisees that were simply wrong. And so in this fact sheet, what we would do is we would provide the actual wording in which we often find these things said. And then we offered corrections. Corrections, here's what could be said instead. And the reason why we ended up talking about these as fact sheets was because it came out of a conversation with the head of the Association of Catholic Publishers of America. And we were going to be preparing a webinar, kind of a training session on publishers about how to prevent misconceptions and erroneous statements from appearing in Catholic publications. And she said, well, what we're really talking about is a style sheet, something that we as the publisher give to our authors to say, please adhere to these guidelines. And so I said, okay, well, we move from style sheet about how to write to fact sheet about what to write and what not to write. Now, one of the problems with telling people about what not to write is it sounds like you're engaging in censorship. But we phrase this always in terms of scholarship. We want to show that we're not just trying to create an apologetic alternative to a negative set of images about Jews and Judaism, but that this is actually fact-based. And that's why we decided to call them fact sheets. And so what we did, also sheets as in a single sheet of paper, 2 sides, back and front. It has to be something that is short enough that people can take whatever their environment may be and not have to end up reading a whole book or a whole article on something, but it can at least find some accurate information and then maybe lead them to the next stage. So I can go through this maybe a little later, but see what we did was we had the basic responses. And then on the back sheet of the paper, we have notes that provide sources, both primary sources in terms of ancient literature, as well as modern scholarship that one can trust about these things. So I'm going to actually stop share here for a moment and say a bit more about the phenomenon of anti-Judaism. So people who study the New Testament and early Judaism often prefer to use the term anti-Judaism rather than anti-Semitism, partly because anti-Semitism in its modern form obviously has been shaped by an ideology of race and intrinsic characteristics and so forth. And certainly that is a modern transformation of hatred of Jews. So anti-Judaism was a way that we could maybe make it a little more contextual and a little less limited to the concept, the modern concept of race. Now, I happen to believe that anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, it's largely semantics, because in terms of the dynamics of concepts, they're doing the same thing, but they're appealing to different rationales for it. But nevertheless, we use the term anti-Judaism. And it is an interesting historical fact that the very term Judaism, Judaismos in Greek, although it does first appear in a Jewish text, 2nd Maccabees, which is a text that was probably 2nd century BCE, maybe 1st century BCE, the word itself is almost never used after that until the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE by Christian apologists. So, I mean, it occurs in the letters of Paul in the New Testament, but there it's not clear what it means. Apparently, what happens is by the 2nd and 3rd century CE, when you have these Christian theologians who are trying to articulate a concept of Christian identity as somehow different from Greco-Roman identity out there, but also different from Jews, they use this term Judaism to mean what is not like us. So the very term Judaism, even though we can use it in a neutral sense today, the very term Judaism emerges as a polemical Christian construct about what Christians are not. And there's a very important book that at least I've found to be very helpful in thinking about these questions. It is a book by a Christian author named Katharina von Kellenbach, Kellenbach, called Anti-Judaism in Feminist Religious Writings. This was a dissertation she wrote in which she was examining how feminists, mostly Christian feminists, were writing about Jews and Judaism as a way of constructing an alternative future for Christianity as a feminist Christianity. This was what we call the second wave of feminism, and it's been heavily critiqued, obviously, by feminists today. But what was helpful about von Kellenbach's work is that she utilized Michel Foucault's concept of rules of formation. How do you form discourse? How do you form ideas? And so she said, well, if you study the way these scholars write about Jews and Judaism, there are basically three techniques, three formations that are used to make Judaism the negative other, the negative foil to Christianity. And she gave words to these three techniques or rules of formation, which I find to be very helpful and very truthful in looking at not just what Christians say and do, but also even some of the formative texts of the Christian tradition. And she called those rules antithesis, scapegoat, and prologue. So antithesis is what I was just talking about in the formation of the Christian notion of Judaism, Judaismos, that you take Judaism, Judaismos may have actually been an activity of, basically in situations like 2nd Maccabees, where the ancestral customs of the Jewish people, the mitzvot, the commandments, were being suppressed by this tyrannical Greek king. Judaismos was the process of taking back the tradition, as it were, reinvigorating the tradition. But the way that Christian apologists used this term in the 2nd and 3rd centuries was as a system of ideas. So this system of ideas in Christian discourse is defined in a way that is the opposite or the antithesis of what Christianity is supposed to be. Now, actually, you can find some of the ingredients of this in the New Testament itself, not suggesting that the New Testament is anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish although you can make an argument for that in some texts. But the example of some of these antitheses, rhetorically, they're already present in the New Testament. So, for example, justice versus love, judgment versus promise, law versus grace. Especially Paul is into rhetorical contrast. There's been a lot of good work that's been done on, obviously, Paul and his letters that offers a different perspective on how to understand that rhetoric. But the way it has been understood, the way it's been weaponized, as it were, is to say Judaism is the negative foil to Christianity. Whatever is good about Christians is bad of Jews. So that's the first rule of formation that defines anti-Judaism. The second is what she calls scapegoating. Now, again, here we have a lot more examples of this in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, the history of what we call the teaching of contempt, in which Jews are blamed for evil in the world. Whatever the problem is, the Jews are the problem, the source of that. And for those of you who have been studying the history of anti-Semitism, you can see that in the Middle Ages with the blood libel, all this kind of stuff. But this idea of scapegoating, right? This is also, the ingredients of this are at least present already in the New Testament. For example, in the way that the trial of Jesus is presented in the four Gospels, I actually would argue that there's a development there. They're not all the same, but by the time you get to John's Gospel, it is the Jews who are responsible for everything. Even though Jesus himself says in his Passion predictions, the Gentiles will kill me. But again, the trial scenes kind of shift that bit. You have also in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, he speaks of the Jews who killed Jesus, the deicide charge. What is the germ of that? Can be found in the New Testament. So this idea of Jews as being somehow insidious or ominous can be applied to any scene of conflict then in the New Testament, and then read as a statement about Jews and Judaism in general in the present. So that was the second rule of formation that von Kellenbach identified. The third one is what she calls prologue, which doesn't sound quite as antagonistic. By prologue, she means the idea that Judaism is conceived of by Christians as simply the ancestor of Christianity, an earlier, less perfect stage of human development that has now been superseded. This is where we get the idea of supersessionism from, and can be happily jettisoned. In some ways, this has roots also in the Christian interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. Now, St. Augustine had a nice formula for this. He said, the old is hidden in the new, or rather the New Testament, the new revelation is hidden in the Old Testament, and the meaning of the old is made manifest in the new. So we certainly know that in earliest Christianity, you have this idea that the Hebrew Bible and the history of Israel are essential frames of reference for the Christian interpretation of Jesus. The question, though, is whether this is a unidirectional process in which the function of Judaism is simply to be subliminal advertising for Jesus, and then once Jesus is there, Israel's history and Israel's significance evaporates, or whether there is some genuine ongoing reciprocity of understanding, for Christians at least, between these two poles of their own scriptures. So these are the three things that von Kellenbach argued were the engines that drive the formation of anti-Judaism and then later anti-Semitism. What I find helpful, I've always found helpful about this way of approaching it, is that anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, whatever terminology you want to use, it cannot be reduced to a single trope. It can't be reduced to a single thing, because its very nature is to be dynamic, to shift, to conceal itself in new language. And often the way this works out, we find when we were doing the work of the task force, often the way that these ancient anti-Jewish tropes survive is not kind of in the Christian nationalist fringe over way on some extreme. It's actually in kind of the central progressive, kind of core of where many people in the United States are today, in which whatever is good and progressive must be what Jesus taught, And therefore, Judaism is the opposite of that. There you have the rule of antithesis. Whatever the problems in the world we're facing are, the Christian framework is the answer, and therefore that means that Judaism must have been the problem that Christianity was the answer to. And then again, finally, with the prologue piece, that if Judaism is only a prologue, then it's at best just a way of seeing how much we've progressed, right? That's where it becomes part of this progressive thing. One example, which both von Kellenbach and other scholars have noted, is the idea of Jesus as the proto-feminist. And this is, not just for feminists. This is that you find this across the ideological and political spectrum of Christian discourse. That Jesus alone in his society treated women with dignity, just like us, right? And therefore, Judaism was patriarchal, misogynistic, and otherwise oppressive to women. Well, the first century was not a feminist paradise. It was, of course, a traditional society with all those, the various ranges in which gender is defined in different ways and all that. But even in my own Catholic tradition, you have documents written by popes, Pope John Paul and people like that, trying to argue why women cannot be priests. And their interesting argument is said, well, Jesus didn't choose any women to be apostles. But in every other way, they say, he was completely different from his society. His society was misogynistic, but he alone saw the dignity of women. So it's a way that an apologetic strategy can say, well, clearly this is not anti-woman because Jesus was pro-woman and so are we. So to say that women can't be priests is not a form of sexism or anything like that, because Jesus was a proto-feminist. So that's one example that's very common. And when I pull these out of the hat, these are things that you can find on the internet, that you can find in reputable publications, popular publications. Usually what has happened over the past 5 or 6 years that I've worked on this task force is Amy Jo Levine will call me up, or more likely email me and say, Chris, there's a problem. You need to go and fix this. So whether it's the National Catholic Reporter or some other website, there'll be just things that are said that are historically inaccurate, and in terms of creating understanding between Jews and Christians, it is problematic for that. And so I will respond with a sort of fact sheet sort of thing here. And usually I'll be ignored. I've been to seminars, listening to seminars by people who talk this kind of language about, Christianity is this progressive antithesis to evil Judaism. And they cast it in more conventional moral language, like that all that is problematic in our world, racism, xenophobia, whatever it might be, that was the religion of Jesus's day, and he brought us out of it. And when I raise my hand and say, well, where's your evidence for that? They just have nothing to say, and or they will be using texts which are amenable to other interpretations that are more historically valid. One of the most prominent things I find, and this is something that Dr. Feldman actually contributed to in our conversation at our last task force meeting, was on the discourse of ritual purity in early Judaism, and how that figures into the accounts of the Gospels, that in the Gospels, when people read stories about Jesus rendering someone ritually clean, these stories will be read as, these terrible Jewish purity regulations, they marginalized people and made them vulnerable and outcast, and Jesus saved them from this. This has nothing to do with what's in the Gospels, but we project this narrative of progress and liberation, whatever the rhetoric might be, and we end up distorting both Jesus and Judaism at the same time. And again, people who do this, they are not raving anti-Semites. They don't think of themselves as anti-Jewish, but they're reproducing the very tropes that have been expressed in other ways, in much more blatant and harmful ways in the past, and thereby they're preserving these tropes. That is pretty much our experience that we've had in working on this issue. So what we have come to now, as I said, are these fact sheets, which are just enough information to give a quick answer to something about why this interpretation doesn't work, and then just enough background to say, if you want to learn more, here is the reputable scholarship, here are the primary sources, this is where you'd want to look. And so our goal is to make these more available to people, because it's really the scholars are not the problem for the most part. Most, certainly historical scholars of early Judaism and Christianity, they know all this stuff, or at least they ought to. It's really the people in the pews, in the streets, in the public square, who have inherited this fund of imagery and tropes that they are not even aware of. And I see it every day in class. I hear it usually once or twice a month in a sermon in church, and they have no idea what they're doing. So the goal is not to make them feel stupid. No, it's like we've all been grown up in a culture that uses these tropes. You did not invent them. You're not responsible for them, but you are responsible, once you know what they are, to learn how to avoid them. And that's why we've moved very much from just saying not what to say, but here's something that you can say instead. Let me pull up that example here of the fact sheet on the Pharisees, just to give you a concrete example, because I've been kind of speaking at a level of abstraction here so far. Okay, I'm going to bring you over to misrepresentation number 2 here. So the misrepresentation is Pharisees were the religious authorities of Jesus's day. I don't know how many sermons I've heard say this. I don't know how many blogs say this, but it's simply not true. Correction: Pharisees had no formal power to impose their will on anyone. They were respected teachers. Most Jews adhered to their traditions voluntarily because of the Pharisees' general liberal and egalitarian positions aligned with popular practice. Another connected problem with that: Pharisees' arrogant elitism alienated the common people. Not according to Josephus. According to Josephus, the common people supported the Pharisees, often against the priests and Sadducees and other sectarian groups. The Pharisees, their practice extended in a liberal way priestly practice such as hand washing to all of Israel. And then we get into the purity thing. Why is purity important? So the example here, misrepresentation number 5, the Pharisees were obsessed with ritual purity, which excluded and devalued others. That's what I hear on the internet all the time. Correction: all Jews, including Jesus, cared about ritual purity. Being ritually impure did not exclude or devalue people, and no gospel story suggests that it did. Most contemporary critics accuse the Pharisees of loosening rather than strengthening the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary. Far from being puritanical extremists, the Pharisees were innovators who sought greater flexibility in how Israel might fulfill God's call to be a holy nation, and so on. You find ways to at least reorient the conversation, and then the question is, well, where do we find evidence for this? You can find it right here, right? And then hopefully you can also be referred to sources, books and articles by scholars that would be able to give you more information about it. But again, our role as scholars, that's one part of it. The other part is the practical, right? It's one thing to tell people what we know about the 1st century or the 2nd century. It's another thing to know how to communicate that to a modern audience without feeling like they're getting lectured at. And that's maybe where a sensitivity, that's where the most important hearers of this are actually people who are religious leaders, who are leaders of faith communities, or who are the people who educate the next generation. They are the ones with the pastoral creativity to be able to translate this scholarship into something that is both constructive and true. Where are we? We're on time, 2:29. This is mostly what I wanted to start out the conversation. Would it be okay if we started doing question and answers? Because I think I'd like to hear what you want me to talk about, and I can respond to those questions.
I think it's certainly possible, Dr. Seeman. So we have already a few questions in the chat, which is Q&A option of chat, and I have a few that came via email. So let's start with the first one. It actually takes us to Nostra Aetate Vatican II document, which is at the core of your task force work. So the question is, you probably can see it, in Nostra Aetate Vatican II, emphasizes that mutual understanding and appreciation can be obtained, especially by way of biblical and theological inquiry and through friendly discussions. Given that the venomous plant of modern anti-Semitism still exists, with verbal and physical, sometimes lethal assaults on Jews are increasing, are friendly discussions and biblical theological inquiry enough to combat the long history of anti-Semitism in the church? What other actions are possible, especially at this moment, to help our Jewish and Muslim neighbors? A multi-layered question for you. So please.
Sure. No, that's a great question, and I would say amen to that. That no, it's not enough. When we were making this proposal to start this task force, I wrote an article evaluating on the Catholic side, what has the church decreed on this, and what efforts have been made to actually implement these changes of approach. And as I said in that article, it's like, it's one thing to say what should be done, it's another thing to make it happen. And because of the fact, and at the time I was writing it, we did not yet have the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism as we have seen over the past couple of years in North America, and I mean, it's always been in Europe in some ways, but this is we are in a sense in a new situation, and no, scholarship is not enough. It can, nor are church documents enough. No matter what is said, about what you should do and what you should avoid, unless ordinary people know how to make those connections and how to say something differently, it's not going to be helpful. And that's why that's been kind of our role. But to speak to your larger question, which is in a sense the more important one, how do we engage public discourse about this as citizens, right? Beyond just whatever our academic background might be. For that, I think we really do need to see the whole history of anti-Semitism. You can't just solve all of these things by saying, if you just read the New Testament differently, everything would be great. Of course it wouldn't. Because anti-Semitism is, again, this kind of protean dynamic of othering people, right? That has no logic to it. I mean, there's no rationality to it. No basis in fact. And whenever you're dealing with people who are basing their worldview on fantasy, you can't always just appeal to logic. You can't appeal to the tradition, right? So, I mean, that's the question itself. It really has almost more to do with, in general, not even with anti-Semitism, but how do you establish a common ground of agreement about what is true in the world? We're farther away from that now than we have ever been, unfortunately. But that's where I think learning how to engage in situations where there is going to be no agreement. You can't simply appeal to tradition. You can't appeal to doctrines or anything like that. You have to point out in what's happening in real time. Not to dip my finger too much into the Gaza-Israel thing, but the only way you can really approach something like that is to begin by what's actually happening. People have ideologies about what should be happening, but you have to look at what's happening on the ground, on both sides, and that it is not. There's no moral equivalency with how it began, but there's it's a complicated situation. But you have to talk about the present and why things are happening in the present. Once we've agreed on what that is, then you can sort of move back and ask the historical question of, why did people think this way in the first place? What is the accumulated history of this contempt of Jews and Judaism that has caused or contributed to this? So the history part, the part that we are sort of responsible for clarifying, that's only a secondary or tertiary element, I think, in contemporary conversation, but it's a part of it. It has to be there. In terms of what can faith communities do about this, that's where I think it becomes more important to be able to assert what is the acceptable spectrum of interpretation of any particular text. That's what religious traditions do. They establish what are the acceptable boundaries, and obviously we need to interrogate those boundaries. We need to show how the very formulation of those rules of reading or rules of speaking have been influenced by this 2,000-year history, and we need to disentangle them from that history. So long-winded answer to your question. So yeah, I think that the role of our task force is actually quite small in this, but it has a role to play.
Thank you very much. You have a couple of questions that target particular times and seasons as far as church life is concerned. Advent, Christmas, the Passion narrative on Palm Sunday.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas, recommendations as to what can be done to avoid anti-Semitic bias?
Well, that is a challenging one because it's during during this period, not so much during the Christmas season, but certainly during the Easter season, is where you get the most problematic narratives, and these narratives are going to be read. Often, certainly in the Catholic tradition, you will have each Passion narrative read on a different day of Holy Week. I think that the only way really to grapple with that, I mean, again, you have plenty of church documents saying you can't say this, you can't do anything that's going to demean Jews. But then you have the problem of the homilist who's saying, okay, but I'm reading a text that's saying these things about the Jews. How do I grapple with that? One of the ways that I've tried to work on that is that whenever we're dealing with that particular issue, the trial of Jesus, the blood libel, all these things, you have to be able to make people realize that these narratives are not all the same. And because they're not all the same, they can't just be video transcripts of what happened. They are formulations of a community. They're formulations of the evangelists. And all you need to do is show them, that the words are not different. Sometimes the process is not different. The way blame is ascribed is not different. I mean, it's never positive, but I would argue that you need to have people see that these are different narratives, and therefore, once you notice they're different and they have different implications within their own context, then it becomes an ethical choice about, am I going to accept this particular narrative uncritically or not? I can't say I'm just following the Bible because it's there. No, there are different versions of this. And if you say, I'm going to go with this, that's on you. So I think readers need to understand their own responsibility, and certainly preachers need to understand that too. So that's one thing that needs to be said. I don't think it's helpful as a strategy for dealing with this to say, from the pulpit or in the context of a celebration of Easter or something, it's not helpful to say this didn't happen or this is just ahistorical, because that's not what's going to be received. People are not going to receive that. They're going to say, well, these are biblical scholars trying to rob us of our faith. No, you have to say, here's what's in the text and here's what it says. And here are other things that are said in the gospel that clearly would tell against the way you might be hearing this. So understanding any text within the whole tradition, within the whole understanding of the faith is absolutely essential. This is part of, in the Catholic tradition, our document is called De Verbum, which is basically biblical hermeneutics. And in this document, it says that there's more than one level of meaning to any sacred text. There is the literal or literary meaning, the meaning that seems to have been intended by the historical author, but that is not all that's there. There is a larger framework of reference that one needs to think about that involves all elements of the faith, including things like you should not hate people and you should not demonize people. So that will obviously create tensions with a particular text if it has that language in it. But this is the very nature of what homiletics is. It's grappling with what a text says and what implications it might have. Is this something we just say amen to, or is it something that can be qualified by a different version of it from another gospel, for example? Again, I'm not a homilist. I've never had to deal with this from the pulpit, but as a receiver of many sermons, this is what I keep saying they should be doing, is you should be drawing attention to the fact that the reader the reader, or in this case, the hearer, has responsibility for what they do with this. It's not just passively hearing the truth and then already knowing what it means. So that would be my response to that when you have these challenging texts, you have to put them in the context of the larger sacred narrative of the community, which could include doctrines, which could include ethical principles that wouldn't correspond with a certain interpretation. That is the very nature of religious tradition, is to create this, what we call in fancy language a hermeneutical circle, right? To have a system of checks and balances, and somehow to bring the sacred narrative into that. But yeah, that's been my experience, is you can't just dismiss the narrative that's being read. You have to somehow put it into a context. And that's where a lot of people have difficulty, because they think that the context is, well, there were good Jews and there were bad Jews. And unfortunately, the bad Jews were the ones who did this. And that's why any Jews who don't think like we do must be bad Jews, right? So that kind of typecasting obviously is not sufficient. But here's a concrete maybe suggestion on that. And again, this is dealing with the passion narratives. So I've written a book on this, on the Gospel according to Mark, on his account of the passion narrative. And I make the case that Mark does not in fact lay blame, this, certainly not in the way that Matthew and Luke and John do, on the Jews or the crowd. According to Mark's Jesus, the way you read everything in that story is the parable of the sower in chapter 4 of Mark. Jesus says this is the lens through which you can interpret and understand everything that happens in this story. And there are only 4 possible responses to the message of the kingdom or to the messenger who's delivering it. You can either it can either be taken away from you by Satan, so this external force is distorting your thought process. It can be fruitless because the message doesn't bear any fruit because you're afraid of dying, you're afraid of persecution, or because you're distracted by some other, or you give the right response. In both of the stories of the death of the messenger, first of John the Baptist and then of Jesus, all 3 of these responses of satanic abduction, which is basically the twisting of perception by ideology or whatever, fear of persecution, and then desire for other things, these are all at work in these stories. In the story of Jesus's trial, it is ironic that the crowds condemn him to death, because they are his only true supporters throughout the entire gospel. Even more consistently than his disciples, the crowds are always his supporters. So when people read the story and they say, aha, the Jews hate Jesus. No, they don't. These are his supporters. Why are his supporters disavowing him? It's because the Roman prefect is putting words in their mouth. He's saying, do you want me to take out this guy who is the king of the Jews? Do you want to associate yourself with this man? By the way, I have my cohort here to take you out as well, like I do in Josephus all the time. If anyone is willing to align themselves with this guy, they're going to suffer the same fate. And so the crowds, out of fear, disavow him, just like the disciples do, the previous chapter. So everyone fails in this story, but no one is the enemy, as turns out certainly in John's gospel and then later ones. So if you know that, and notice I didn't give you some fancy historical theory about why that's the case. I just said, just read the parable of the sower. That's how Jesus says that you should read this. And so again, in a homily or a sermon, when you're trying to appeal to the authority of the text, you say there's another part of this text that tells us how we should read this. And then you discover there's another way of reading it that is in fact not the one that says the Jews are at fault. So that's not meant as an apologetic at all. It's saying, if you look at the text, there are frames of reference that allow you to look at it differently from your assumptions about what it means. So again, long-winded answer. Let's do another question.
Yeah, let's get another one. So 2 questions along the same lines of thinking about supersessionism in our tradition. What do I do with New Covenant at the communion? One question asks.
Okay.
And how do I preach about resurrection without being supersessionist?
Yes. Okay, so first of all, we need to define what supersessionism is. Obviously, the way in which it's often been cast is supersessionism. Who or what is superseding who or what is really the question. The destructive version of that is that the church supersedes Israel, right? The church supersedes Israel. The new covenant supersedes the old covenant, and so on, thereby nullifying the former, whatever is the former. That comes from actual language in the New Testament, but it is not referring to that. So first of all, what is being superseded? So the most supersessionist document in the New Testament, which is the so-called letter to the Hebrews, that is explicitly supersessionistic. But who or what is being superseded? What is being superseded is a system of sacrifice. And it is being replaced by what he calls a better system of sacrifice. Now, he does talk about an old covenant and a new covenant, but what he's talking about is the system of sacrifice that is validated by those two systems. So yes, in that document, the sacrificial program of the tabernacle has been superseded and improved upon. And there is some fairly negative language about the superseded system. Israel is not superseded. Jews are not referred to in that text, nor are Gentiles. There's nothing about that there. There is no supersession of one people by another or one community by another. So focusing really on what is being superseded is important for dealing with that. The rabbis engaged in exactly the same tactics. Dr. Feldman can tell you about that, about how with the destruction of the temple, they thought that even though in theory, the sacrificial system is still pertinent, in practice, it has been superseded by acts of loving kindness because you don't have an altar anymore. So in their own ways, both Judaism and Christianity superseded an earlier system that no longer existed. Beyond that, though, to the point about, is there anything in the New Testament about the church superseding Israel? I've looked really hard to see if I could find any. I can't find any. I can certainly find language that could be read that way, but I don't think that one finds that anywhere in any New Testament document. I'm not a patristic scholar, so I can't tell you where that enters into the tradition. But here's what I do find. There is language of a new covenant. It's in Paul, the earliest Christian writer. But what is that new covenant, and how does it relate to the eternal covenant? Again, as someone who has to teach Hebrew Bible, I say there are only three eternal covenants, only three Berit Olam, right? There's the Noachic covenant with everyone. There's the Abraham covenant with all of his descendants, not just Israel, but everyone else. And then there's the Israelite covenant. There are three covenants because there are three different purposes they're performing. The Noachic covenant prohibits violence. The Abrahamic covenant establishes blessing. And the Israelite covenant enables people to become holy. So what is Christianity? Is it a fourth covenant? If you look at it within the framework of Scripture, is it a fourth eternal covenant? Or is it an extension of covenant number 3? And if you read Paul, it's an extension of covenant number 3. Yes, he does have the this and that rhetoric of law and grace and things like that. But people who have studied Paul have argued quite cogently that he's speaking about a very specific issue there. He's speaking about the practical issue of how do non-Jews become part of this eternal covenant. I don't want to suggest that there's a simple answer to Paul. There isn't. Some people, wonder whether Paul has a coherent position on some of these things. But that's a separate issue. For him, he is the apostle to the Gentiles. The whole point for him is that the call to holiness in Leviticus 19, the call to holiness for Israel has now been extended to the nations. It's not in that sense, it's not a new covenant. The content of holiness does not change. Where we see the difference being worked out is in Acts 15, where the so-called Council of Jerusalem, where they're trying to decide on what basis can non-Jews enter into this new, renewed, whatever covenant. And the answer is Moses. Read what are the commandments within the Israelite covenant for resident aliens living in Israel. You have to abstain from idols. You have to abstain from blood. You have to abstain from porneia, from whatever that is, probably Leviticus 18, all the sexual prohibitions. And you have to abstain from strangled meat. It's not the 10 Commandments, it's what Moses said that Gentiles had to observe. Now, obviously, this became itself as a kind of solution for explaining Gentile joining of Israel became kind of forgotten, but as one of the earliest church images of who the church was, it was Israel and the nations who have chose to join it on the basis of these commandments, faith in Jesus, etc. So I think within the New Testament, there are plenty of non-supersessionistic models that see this. The novelty of the new covenant is that it is somehow, either in the synoptic version, it is somehow preparatory for the world to come, which hasn't happened yet, or it is some kind of mystical union with the divine, as in John's gospel. It somehow extends beyond the existing model of holiness that you find in the Torah, but it is not a nullification of that in any way. So the first part of the answer is that the New Testament is supersessionist, but not of Israel, and not even of Jews observing the mitzvot. There's no place in the New Testament that says Jews should not observe the mitzvot. Paul proudly proclaims that he is a Pharisee, blameless according to the law, in the present tense. You have Pharisees who join the Christian community as Pharisees. They don't lose their Jewish ethnicity or their sectarian identity. Now, obviously, things had developed differently as you move into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but at least within the foundational texts of Christianity, there are other ways of thinking about that do not involve a vicious, supersessionism of, therefore, Israel and the Jews have no more function in history, so they can be ghettoized, destroyed, whatever, which is the way that Christianity went for most of the 20 centuries after that. So finding some place within the core texts of an alternative reading, not like you don't suppress the problematic passages, you just say that's not the only thing that's said, that's not the only model that's made available. So that would be my approach to that. And again, I'm not a systematic theologian or a dogmatic theologian, so I can't tell you how that would work in practice in terms of relating it to a church's tradition and doctrines and so forth. All I'm saying is that as a reader, it seems pretty plain that there are only 3 covenants, and then the new covenant is the extension of that third one for Gentiles, and of course for Jews too, in Paul's view. But even there, as many people who have studied Paul's letters have noted that the supersessionist reading is very difficult to sustain if one reads it in the context of first century polemics and so forth.
Thank you. This is very helpful. And to give it a more contemporary flavor, maybe, there's a question about current conspiracies, especially from the far right, which are rampant in American society and actively undermine democratic institutions. Is there anything you would like to say about the anti-Semitic roots of conspiracy theories like QAnon, the deep state, George Soros, and there are many more? Are there any distinctions to make between this and the ones you've discussed?
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I'm not a specialist on these conspiracy theories. I've heard of them and know a bit of them. And of course, I know that in some cases the anti-Semitic element is explicit in them. But even when it's not explicit, they often contain the same structure as anti-Semitism. Because again, the whole purpose of anti-Semitism or Jew hatred as an ideology and as a practice is to exceptionalize one group of people and make them the metaphysical enemy of all that exists. And you can plug into that basic structure any particular political context or ethnic context or whatever the situation might be. Again, what I would say, and this is just my opinion as a reader of the Bible, I would say that the very nature of these conspiracy theories, the ingredients for them are in the New Testament, and that is where they come from. The ingredients for them. As a Christian, as a committed Christian, I believe that these works are divinely inspired, and through them, something essential is revealed about human nature and salvation and all those wonderful things. But at least in the Catholic tradition, we believe as a point of dogma that these are 100% human documents by historically contingent authors who are shaped by ideologies, agendas, etc. Just like the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, Jesus is not 50% human and 50% divine, it's 100%, 100%. So Christians need to find a way to affirm their doctrines about the Bible and everything else, but say that doesn't mean that there's no politics. That doesn't mean there's no ideology there. That doesn't mean that there's structures that are unhelpful and that can be an impediment to understanding the broader goals and beliefs of the faith. But to jump now to what I was trying to get at here, the structure of conspiracy theory, the ingredients for that can be found in the New Testament. They're not unique to the New Testament. You can find the ingredients of that kind of typecasting in other Greco-Roman documents, especially after the year 70, when it became convenient for the Flavians to propagandize against the Jews as those terrible rebellious people, to show this is why the gods put us in charge of the Roman Empire. So it's not that these are uniquely Christian, but is because they are these documents that Christians see as fundamental. They are rooted in the first century. I think the most important element of this comes from the Gospels. I think the Gospels are, in a sense, the most problematic texts for understanding where these things come from and what they morph into. Because you have generic rhetorical structures in the Gospels, but when you then, especially in John's Gospel, when you turn oppositional rhetoric into to give it a metaphysical foundation, then you have a great disadvantage of trying to disentangle this from any particular abuse or hatred. So in the Synoptic Gospels, however evil the evil enemy is, the basic explanation is that the enemy has been the people opposing Jesus or whoever. They are doing this because they have been deceived. Their way of looking at the world has been twisted by something outside themselves. Jesus calls Peter Satan because he's thinking the things of humans, not of God. By fear, by distraction with other things. It's always environmental factors in the synoptic understanding of why people do what they do. When you get to John, the rhetoric changes from environment to nature, from nurture to nature. So if someone is opposed, does not believe in Jesus, it is because they are children of the devil. That is exactly the tagline from John 8 that Robert Bauer used when he murdered 11 Jews in the worst anti-Semitic massacre in U.S. history 5 years ago down the road from where I live in Pittsburgh. That was his tagline. That was his inspiration. So we can't say that the ingredients are not there. But that's why this is problematic. Once you say this is a matter of begetting, you begotten by a metaphysical reality, whether either God or the devil, then this is intrinsic to your nature. Now, the way you get out of that, the way you avoid that implication from that language is to say, well, all you need to do is read the rest of the Johannine literature. You read 1 John and you see that this same language is applied to members of the community whenever they fail to behave according to the community norms, whether it's because they have left us because they never belonged to us, or whether if anyone hates their brother and says they love God, they are a liar. That when one looks at the entirety of Johannine, I guess anthropology would call it, it is performative. Identity is performative. When you are loving and not hating, you are begotten by God. And when you're not, you're, at least at that moment, begotten by the devil. So there is this difficulty of Johannine language, especially when we take it out of its performative context and make it be about a certain group of people. and then we racialize it, and that makes it indelible. You can't change race in the 19th century understanding. And once you do that, then you've created, again, a metaphysical enemy. And you've rooted that metaphysical enemy in a sacred narrative. And it's very difficult to find an alternative to that reading. So I would say, yeah, the ingredients are there. And once you understand what, again, von Kellenbach calls the rules of formation of this discourse, you can see how it modulates itself throughout history. And again, not having done a study of these conspiracy theories today, but from what I've heard, I mean, it sounds like these operate according to the same basic, modes of thinking about people.
Thank you very much, Professor Seeman. I think our time is up, unfortunately. We could go much longer, folks, but unfortunately we have to stop to honor your time commitments. So thank you very much, our dear guest, for your presentation, for your thoughts, for your responding to our questions. We will send you some of the questions by email for you to consider for us.
I'd be happy to respond.
Thank you. Special thanks go to Vanessa Daly and Lauren Baxter, who have been with us and made this event possible with such great care. And for all of you who have been with us today, thank you. Please stay tuned to our other Cristol Zoom events in the spring semester. And for all of you, goodbye now, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.